One of the real troubles with living is that living is so banal, 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 banal.
Hey, this is Nick.
This is David.
And this is Nathan, and welcome back to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. Today we're talking about James Baldwin's novella Giovanni's Room, which is about an American expat in Paris who has a love affair with a bartender named Giovanni. So let's start off with this question we ask every time. Is this book of substance? David, what do you think?
Historically, yes, considering who wrote it, what the story is about, and when it was published. It is a very brave novel. However, as a novel, I found it kind of lacking in terms of narrative. You know, all of Baldwin's writing is still there. A lot of his insight, his depth, the aphorisms that capture certain aspects of humanity are there, and they're wonderful. But the basic story and the character who's narrating the story, I found incredibly weak. And ultimately, I think it detracted from my enjoyment of the book and making it a book of substance. So I'm afraid this is, again, one of these things that we've talked about where it's kind of a sort of historical piece. I find value in it and substance in it for seeing what it's about, when it was written, etc. But it's not quite up to what I believe is Baldwin's greatness. Nick, how about you?
I think I'm in a similar boat. Last episode, I kind of talked about how just really into James Baldwin. And I think I was a little bit surprised myself, like having been prepped to be very into Giovanni's Room, that I sort of found it to be one of my least favorite Baldwins. And I think you hit on some of those, like it's a little bit melodramatic. I also sort of wonder if just the premise of like the American expat in Paris, if that's just sort of a tired, worn out thing to us now after we look at this many decades later. Also, I guess I just didn't really believe the love story in any way. I didn't believe a lot of the emotions and just didn't feel any of the impact. And that's kind of what I'm curious. I'm going to ask Nathan is that I know that you're the one of the group that actually was into this the most. So I'm curious what you got out of it, what you felt, all of those good things.
So Nick just outed me. I did enjoy this book. And I would say that, yes, it is of substance. And I'm curious how this conversation is going to unfold, because while I agree with a lot of things that you're saying, I didn't judge it critically for those things. Like I enjoyed Baldwin's maybe typical sermonistic quality where he interweaves a narrative with a little bit more of an omniscient voice talking about observations of humanity. I enjoyed his descriptions where he would fall out of the narrative a little bit and describe something in minute detail. And I really love the way he describes the characters of Paris in the 1950s. And while the story is a little melodramatic, I think of it, it's a love story in sort of the classic mold in a lot of ways, in the way that maybe a Romeo and Juliet is melodramatic. And I guess I'm okay with that. I'm okay with those trappings. And I think we'll probably talk about the ending. And I know that the other guys feel like it was a bit heavy-handed, and maybe that's so, but maybe I didn't find fault with that either, and the melodrama of that. I do agree with, and I would like to talk about the way that he developed his main characters, David and Giovanni, because David is the character of David is very shallow. Like, we don't actually learn a whole lot about him throughout the story. And I would say in some ways Giovanni is kind of similar. So maybe we can jump off at that point and talk about some of the character development there.
Yeah, no, I agree that one of the limitations is that a lot of these people seem to be, I don't even want to say stereotypes, but sort of just flat personas. And I think the emotional connection with, even as we learn with like the background of Giovanni and his life in small town Italy and his prior relationship and his stillborn child that sort of like leads him to flee to Paris. And as we learn about David and his background, his difficult relationship with his dad, and his mother had passed away when he was younger, and his affair with Joey when he was a teenager, all of these things to me are supposed to start to build out some sort of humanity for these characters. But I didn't really ever feel that they passed from just sort of flat backstory. And I don't know, I know, David, you kind of have some insight into this as to just how characters develop and, what you were sort of viewing the characters as they progressed. And so I'm curious, just I don't know what you feel about that.
Wait, before we progress, we should probably clarify that the protagonist in this book's name is David.
As
Also.
is the podcaster.
Yeah. So just so that doesn't get confusing for our listeners.
So something you kind of both hit on was, Nick, you said that you didn't really buy the love story because of the shallowness of the characters. And Nathan, you said that David and Giovanni are both somewhat shallow, but yet it fell into a sort of classic love story with certain melodrama. The issue here is that the melodrama is there, but the depth is not. And there is one way of reading this and maybe getting a little more out of it, and that's reading David, the narrator, the protagonist, as more of a sort of an existential character. You know, someone like Merceau from The Stranger, sort of this somewhat of a shallow person. And I was thinking about it this morning and a little bit last night. I don't see Giovanni as being the love of David's life that really challenges him. To me, it's more that Giovanni allowed him to be himself, and therefore he feels that he loves Giovanni, and therefore there should be that strong connection. But the issue, even with that reading, is that even though this relationship really allows him to be himself and be the homosexual man that he is kind of fighting in the beginning of the book, we still don't really get any depth of character after that. So we get this idea that Giovanni might represent something for him, and this coming out, this sort of being oneself, and yet there's still not a fully developed self there. His actions are never fully explained. His desires are never fully explained outside of what he doesn't want.
So I agree with you as far as the love story. I don't know that David actually loves Giovanni. I don't think he's supposed to. I think that, to me, he is a very existential character who's trying to understand himself throughout the story. And I appreciate that reading, that he thinks that he loves Giovanni because he gains a greater understanding of himself. And I actually liked the way that the book ended. Like, he's not celebrating that now he knows who he is. He's still in this malaise. He doesn't actually gain anything. He still is uncertain of what the next step is that he should take, or that he can take.
Isn't that a problem, though? I mean, classically, and even in experimental fiction, there's a central character going on a journey of some kind, and Baldwin sets that up from the beginning, and it's written as if it's going to be a journey, and the melodrama is there as if he's learning something, but it's never realized. And maybe that is its charm, maybe that's what it's trying to do, but the language certainly doesn't imply that that's what it's doing.
Should we talk a little bit about what that journey is, since we have this awesome knack for talking about the ending 17 minutes into the podcast episode?
To be fair, the book does start with the ending.
That's true, right? It's cyclical, right? I get that.
Maybe a little summarization is in order. All right. So we have the central character, David. He's in Paris. His girlfriend / fiance has taken a trip to Spain and left him alone. And he's running out of money. He's there. He has no job. His father, who doesn't really know his son, is sending him bits of money here and there, but is starting to get concerned and sending him less and less over time. So he's running out of money. He's kicked out of his hotel. He hits up this older man for a loan, and part of getting the loan is spending time with this man. And they go to this bar where Giovanni is the bartender, and as Nick said earlier off air, Giovanni is sort of the eye candy for this gay bar in Paris. David and Giovanni hit it off, and eventually, I think it's actually that very night, after kind of bar hopping and getting drunk on white wine and oysters, yuck, and he ends up at Giovanni's little room, which is like a maid chamber in some building, and he ends up staying with Giovanni for, it seems like it could be a couple of weeks to a couple of months.
I think it was a couple months.
Yeah, I think it's a few months.
The summer.
Okay, so yeah, he's there in Giovanni's room for a few months, and they're having this love affair. All the while, David is sort of fearful of Hella, his girlfriend, fiancée. Or do they become engaged once she returns? That's another timeline.
He proposed before she left, and then she left
to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
She came back.
Right. Yeah, so she eventually returns, and he abandons Giovanni. Giovanni, the ever-dramatic Giovanni, really feels incredibly attached to David, sort of loses his mind a bit, falls in with these, what the book kind of calls as kind of these old queens, these old, rich, homosexual men who take in the younger, pamper them, give them money, and they sort of fall into this trap. And eventually, Giovanni, I guess in a fit of desperation, kills one of these old men, and that's the man that ran the bar that Giovanni once worked at. Is that a fair summarization of the entire plot?
Yeah.
I think the only thing left to summarize is that Giovanni is sentenced to the guillotine, which is kind of a knife hanging over this whole story. And David and Hella eventually split up, and the book ends with him alone, awaiting Giovanni's execution in a house in southern France.
And he tears up a note detailing his execution. He throws it in the wind, and some of it blows back on him.
Yeah.
And
you can't escape the past, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, that ending was a real turd.
Yeah.
It's felt so ham-fisted.
Like the literal ending where the paper
Right.
blows back on him.
I mean, to me, it felt like the end of a goth rock music video from 1994. Just like...
Or any emo
right.
punk band from the 90s. Just
Wait, was I the only one into emo in the 90s?
No, I was. Doesn't mean that their music videos are any good.
Or either of your tastes.
Hey, whoa.
Also true.
Whoa. We can take this off air, but there were some gems.
But yeah, so that's the journey as we work through that. So I guess, yeah, now we can talk about the ending as what that means, as what predated this whole discussion of what the journey was, Nathan.
Yes. So then my question is to Nathan, do you feel like David actually went through a journey? And if he did, what did we, the reader, get out of that?
Yes, I think that he did. I think I'm going to read a quote real quick that I think does a better job of summarizing the ending than the symbol of the paper blowing back on his trousers. So this is early in the book, which is, I think he's also in the same place because the book begins and ends in the same scene. But he says, "Then perhaps life only offers the choice of remembering the garden or forgetting it. Either or. It takes strength to remember. It takes another kind of strength to forget. It takes a hero to do both. People who remember court madness through pain, the pain of perpetually recurring death of their innocence. People who forget court another kind of madness, the madness of the denial of pain and the hatred of innocence. And the world is mostly divided between madmen who remember and madmen who forget. Heroes are rare." Which I think is a pretty major theme of the story, is like that I think transcends a love story, transcends historical significance of this being a gay novel. It's like, if you experience something that feels right, you experience that Garden of Eden moment, you can't stay there. We probably all have something in our past that was an amazing time, but you can't stay there. You have to live on in life. What do you do with that memory? Do you hold on to it and try to remember it and deal with that pain? Or do you try to forget it and deal with that pain? And I think that's what, maybe the cornball imagery at the end is trying to encapsulate. In that sentiment, I really appreciate, and I really like the way that he, early in the book, the way that he described that.
So the old "nothing gold can stay" ending, or "stay gold, pony boy." I'm actually convinced that this, while part of the reason why I at least am struggling with it, is because I think it actually was a foundation for a lot of stuff that I already like. And because of that, it feels a little...
You feel like this has been articulated better since?
Maybe not even better, but just many times. And I think that's a little bit what I'm struggling with, because I like that sentiment. I like David's earlier reading of just sort of the existential character in the style of Camus. Like that all like works with me really well. But I think because this seems, to be honest, it's early in James Baldwin's career. Go Tell on the Mountain was absolutely fantastic. So I don't want to just sort of slate off James Baldwin's career and certain times of it for being better or worse. But, maybe he hadn't totally honed a craft, but maybe he also hit something that that became a framework for a lot of other stuff. And just at this point, like we've heard a lot of expat novels, we've heard a lot of, this style of like mournful love story. We've heard a lot of these existential like journeys that may or may not lead anywhere. And so maybe I'm just sort of got too many repetitions.
I mean, it's funny, like that sounds like a formula for success to me.
Right. It's like you're listing off all of my favorite things right now.
I mean, the long and the short of it is I just enjoyed it. I really enjoyed reading it. I highlighted the most in the book. So if there's like a part where I was most engaged, probably the first 3 chapters where he kind of is building up his sermon. And then there's the long anecdote, which is probably the middle chunk of the book, and then the summary or the conclusion. And I would say that the conclusion in my mind is probably the weakest. Like I think he does a better job building up the story in terms of like what are his kind of universal observations of humanity that he's going to reveal through this narrative early in the book. And that probably, the way that he led that up and like framed the story that he was going to tell, helped me appreciate the rest of the story. And the conclusion, I'd already loved the book at that point, so I wasn't going to change my mind because of the ham-fistery at the end. And there was some stuff at the end too. Like I really liked the character, the woman who I don't know what she was exactly. She was watching over the house that he was renting. And some of his observations about her and just his way of getting at a specificity of character really quickly. You know, this woman, who's traditional and kind of scolding him for his way of living and for letting his woman leave and for letting his life fall apart in this house. But him having a great deal of sympathy for her and what she's gone through, being, going through the war and losing everything, and kind of the little indicators of that. How did that mark her appearance and her behavior?
See, to me, she felt so stock. Sweet little old lady who gives a little nugget of wisdom to him. A lot of it felt, unfortunately, I kind of agree with Nick, a little bit played out.
But pre-played out.
Not really. I mean, this was written after all the expats were in France in the 1920s. This is after Henry Miller's adventures. And maybe because, like you said, we're so distanced from it, and just the idea of an American going to Europe to find themselves feels like such a cliche.
I mean, he mocks that,
he does.
Giovanni mocks that in the book, and like, what's it with you Americans trying to find yourself? What's lost?
And I agreed with that sentiment, and yet the book just kept playing that. And the passage that you read about Eden, I'm not entirely sure what it's trying to say. You say it's about either moving on from something or holding on to it. But that sort of clashes with this idea of what Eden is, which to me, I was reading that passage as sort of, again, going back to the ending of the novel, is understanding what you believe to be your nature, who you really are. And to me, that's what that passage was more about, was the ability to either become who you are or deny who you are.
So the symbol of the Garden of Eden, what you're saying is the symbol of Garden of Eden isn't about easy, pleasurable, entertaining, ideal place to be. It's about being who you were born to be in your essence.
Yeah, I can't imagine that Baldwin, the ex-preacher and son of a preacher, would use that image lightly as being like something that's just a nice place to be. I assumed it had a sort of biblical and original meaning, this idea of this is who you are in your most natural state kind of thing.
Does kind of have a darkness looming over it because of what happens after, of course.
Yeah.
I don't know if I see that as being totally separate. Can you be your true self in society? To be in a society, we wear masks, we play roles. We may find ourselves to be our pure self, on a hammock in the Caribbean. But is that a life that one can lead? Or do you have to balance that with, other responsibilities in society? And if you do that, are you abandoning your true self? What do you do with that image of your true self if you're constantly thinking like, oh, if I was only on a hammock in the Caribbean, then I would be pure. I'd remain in the Garden of Eden. But we can't. None of us can remain there. We have to live this dirty, complicated life.
you just hit on, I think, I'll pivot to one of the things that I really loved, which was the quote about self-deception. You remember?
Yeah. That was early in the book. I like that a lot too.
Yeah, people who believe that they are strong-willed and the masters of their destiny can only continue to believe this by becoming specialists in self-deception. Their decisions are not really decisions at all. A real decision makes one humble. One knows that it is at the mercy of more things than can be named. But elaborate systems of evasion, of illusion, designed to make themselves and the world appear to be what they and the world are not. If there's a way of reading this book and kind of getting more out of it, it's reading that David starts the book in one mode of self-deception and delusion and ends in another one. He acknowledges that he's a homosexual, but he's still fighting something. I think maybe that's the issue, is that at the end of the book, it seemed like it was building towards his acceptance, and yet he still feels like he's fighting something different that is not yet named.
Yeah, I wonder if Baldwin is kind of playing with that idea of like finding your true self and basically just hanging it out to dry and saying this is sort of a stupid concept, right? I mean, we are shaped through just like the progression of time, the degradation, and like the passage that I kind of like that put this like a little wittily is when David and Jacques are talking. And so David starts out and he goes, "I'm sorry, but I think since you bring it up that a lot of your life is despicable." And then Jacques says, "I could say the same about yours. There are so many ways of being despicable that it quite makes one's head spin. But the way to be really despicable is to be contemptuous of other people's pain. You ought to have some apprehension that the man you see before you was once even younger than you are now and arrived at his present wretchedness by imperceptible degrees." And so I think Baldwin is also maybe kind of calling out like, oh, this expat novel of finding your true self. And that, Nathan, you mentioned the woman at the end of the book. There's sort of this balance between passion and being practical. And that I didn't find the woman to be as stock as David said, because I actually thought it was like a little bit of a jab in the side where she kind of comes in and says, "Oh, well, you're having problems with your love life. Well, look at all this shit that I had to live through." Like, let's put this all in perspective. And then Jacques also saying, "Oh, like you're having this issue with your sort of internal battles and this idea of purity, and I'm this just disgusting old man, but like you're going to get there eventually too." And so like I just like that Baldwin's taking this searching of a true self and the passion associated with it, but I think he's also like outlining that it's kind of BS. And I think that was one of like the better things that I got out of this novel, that I think Baldwin always has a great ability to paint things on a full spectrum. And while I felt this to be decently flat in a lot of ways, that was one degree that he did add like extra depth and dimension to it.
So in that reading, then, the reader's not supposed to like David because he never really gains that perspective. He's just constantly that expat drinking too much and wallowing in self-pity.
I kind of hate David, but I hate David in a way that was not useful to me. I really love fiction I love fiction where you hate the character, but it also like pulls out things from yourself, and it's sort of used as a tool to sort of help you come to terms with your own flaws and your own identity and to put humanity in it. And I thought David was actually lacking. He was just kind of despicable across the board. Maybe not despicable, but I didn't feel that he lended that depth. Like that's the word I keep coming back to.
Yeah. He was just there, and
right.
He was mopey. He was mopey.
So David
he never really gave into any of the strong emotions that seemed to be there either.
I like that your summary is that the main character was mopey, and the ending of the novel was a turd.
I mean, something interesting that I found about the character is like how it's almost not necessary for him to be a character at all. Like he's so passive through the whole story. Like the only moment really where he's actively engaging with anybody is when he convinces that girl that he hates to sleep with him, and in which it stands out starkly in the story because everything else is somebody's telling him something, somebody's doing something to him. You know, things are happening before him. He's observing things, but he so rarely takes any action. Like even the way that he gets kind of seduced by Giovanni, I guess, into moving to his room. The whole time he's just kind of like, I don't really want to do this. Oh, but I can't say anything now because that would, look bad, or that'd be impolite. But if I can get out of this, but I can't. And he's so weak-willed, and anybody with a stronger will just kind of like pushes him along, which finally leads him to kind of rebel against that and force himself basically onto this other woman that he despises.
What do you make of that, though?
To me, I mean, it kind of felt like a, I don't know, like a first-person shooter video game, right? You're like, you don't even know what your character looks like because you're just like in that perspective, and so it's just kind of a screen into what's happening.
So it's like F. Scott Fitzgerald meets Wolfenstein?
Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps this is a good time to touch on the actual like misogyny of this book, which to me was a little surprising because it is sort of labeled as kind of an early like LGBTQ novel. And you actually find that many of the characters, including Giovanni himself, David, and the sort of the brief we'll call it affair that he had with the woman that he didn't even like towards the end of the novel, they're not reassuring, they're not friendly, they're very mean, honestly.
Yeah. So Giovanni says, these absurd women running around today full of ideas and nonsense and thinking themselves equal to men. Quelle rigolade. They need to be beaten half to death so that they can find out who rules the world. And David says, I laughed.
Right. That's
not me. That's the narrator.
Right. That's all.
Yeah.
That's what we would call mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I like I said, in searching for things I did like, I do like that there's grit to this. And I don't mean that I need to read novels with that sentiment, but that these characters are all so deeply, I mean, not even flawed, they're just not very likable.
Yeah.
And I think that like sort of gives more shade to kind of just the idea that this is maybe Baldwin just talking about life's slow degradation, and just the search for true self is never going to happen.
I think that's true. I just want to touch on one more thing about the characters not being likable. You said Giovanni sometimes said things that you liked, and I agree. He has a couple of one-liners that are funny, but whenever he was going to tell a story, I wanted to skip pages or shoot myself in the head. Like when he was telling the story about being fired, and it went on for like 8 pages, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this guy walked in, and then this happened. I just found him incredibly boring as a character. And then at the end, when he's overwhelmed by this passion and love for David, and because David is so not much of a character, or not a character at all, as Nathan described it, it feels overly dramatic because you can't understand why he would love David.
Yeah, I found Giovanni to be like a specific type of character, almost a stereotype, almost like a persona that exists, where it's thin in a lot of ways, and that sort of gives play to this overdramatic but also sort of very pedantic view of things. And like that story that you're talking about, I agree. I was just like, well, when is this thing going to be over? We sort of already know what it is. And it's just like, you probably know people who get so wrapped up in the tiniest details and then turn them into the biggest emotional things. And naturally, it did end up being a big thing because he strangled the guy with his sash of his robe. But yeah, the style of discussion, like I feel like Giovanni just has 2 modes. He has sort of dark wit to him, full of lots of little clever quips about the city and life and how Americans operate in Paris. But then he's also just has this extra mode where like his emotions just redline in him. And in a weird way, it becomes, like I said, more pedantic, more childish. And that's when he's, throwing his glass of liquor around the room and stuff. And I don't know, it seemed, again, unlikable. I mean, just not very identifiable.
Pretty much every character is incredibly selfish in the book. I would say maybe the one character who transcends that a little bit is Jacques, who is my favorite character.
What?
Absolutely.
Oh,
and
your favorite character is Jacques?
And Hella, who tries to I think, overcome that at the end. Yeah, I actually really liked Jacques. I mean, I think he was aware of his state. And
I can see that.
He made the statement that you read about, like, arriving at his current state through imperceptible degrees. There is the early in the book, Dave is describing him as somebody who doesn't like anybody, but wants to like everybody, and so he overcompensates and then is taken advantage of by everybody, which I liked that description. And then later when he's telling David when David's kind of entering into this love affair with Giovanni and resistant to it, and Jacques pulls him aside and he says, love him in the way that you love him. If you think that it's filthy, it will be filthy. And I don't remember exactly what he says, but basically you'll make of it what you make of it. Like what you bring into it is what you'll get out of it. And he seems to be the only character who has really any awareness beyond his own selfish desires, and even aware of his own selfish desires and how that's affecting him. Jacques is kind of the tragic character to me, because it's like, and I think a big part of the book is in terms of maybe the LGBT significance of it, is what happens in a society where there's so much shame associated with what you're doing, and Jacques recognizes that and reflects on that, where the other characters don't really. Giovanni just is a fireball through life and just kind of does what he wants and suffers the consequences. Guillaume, who's the that owns the bar and is murdered by Giovanni, I think is legitimately just a disgusting old queen who doesn't really have any moral values. He's just kind of rich and decadent. And David is an observer of all of this, but is so passive that doesn't really seem capable of reflecting or learning much.
Just saying Jacques is like 5% Zen.
David is passive in the actions of the plot, but yet you see him thinking about things and making these perceptions of things that are interesting and are deep, but they just don't reflect outward into his action in his life.
Yeah, and I think I kind of appreciate that. I mean, it's kind of a classic. He's a writer. I don't know if he's supposed to be a writer as a character, but he definitely appears to be one who doesn't. It reminds me of kind of like a Murakami protagonist. He doesn't do anything. He observes all this weird stuff and then offers up insights. But in the plot development, he's only there to observe it. If the observations are good, I can forgive a shallow character.
So after hearing Nathan sell it, Nick, has talking about it given you a different perspective? Do you feel any different about this novel?
I think ultimately no. I think part of the reason for that is I didn't hate it. I mean, this is still a novel that I'm happy that I read. It just would probably be the fifth or sixth Baldwin that I would recommend to someone. I would pick a lot of his other major works of fiction. I would pick some of his essays as things that are genuinely moving, genuinely, like I said, Baldwin paints this spectrum and just really gives humanity to lots of difficult issues. And I think there's elements of that in here, but I really felt that it lacked a lot of impact for me. And I studied that a lot and being like, oh, do I just not understand the content? Is it the repetitions of this style of book that are sort of diluting it for me, even though maybe this happened before, or at least in the middle of when that was in the fashion? But I think I like it some, but I think it's still kind of just middle of the road for me. What about you, David? Did you get converted?
No, not really. I mean, because I love Baldwin's writing so much, there's going to be lines that I appreciate. Like I'm just flipping through, and there's just little pieces like when David's talking to Hella. It's cold, she said, out here in the old world. Well, it's pretty cold out there in the new one too, I said. It's cold out here, period. Just like I liked the little like banter between the two of them, and I actually thought Hella was my favorite character, actually. I know, Nathan, you said you liked Jacques, but Hella, to me, I wanted to know more about her, and I found that she had insight. When she started talking about what it was like to be a woman in the world, I thought there was insight there, more insight than than David provided on what it was like to be a homosexual in Paris, actually.
Yeah, totally agree.
So there are parts of this book that I think are good and some lines that are great, but overall, I think because of the narrator's shallowness, I found it hard to really enjoy it, and I don't know if it's something I would recommend. Like you said, I would go with another Baldwin.
Yeah, and actually, as you mentioned that thing about her description, Hella's description of like what it's like to be a woman, David's response to that was just sort of like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like it was actually like an opportunity, and again, maybe this is Baldwin doing it on purpose to like re-bolster how flat and sort of unlikable David is, but it was just sort of, to me, that was like an excellent opportunity that just maybe due to the existential nature of this journey, if you will, just was immediately cut off for the impact of making David even less of a likable guy.
Yeah, because it has nothing to do with him, so why does he care?
Right. So, Nathan?
Sorry, I just realized there was something else that I wanted to talk about that we haven't touched on, and that is Giovanni's room.
Oh, like the title of this and the
like
metaphor and the symbol and the everything?
Like the actual room itself and the symbolism of that. I mean, it seems to me that the room is representative, is symbolic of homosexuality itself, and that it's this small, cramped space in which there's no future. There's no way that you can improve it. In this, obviously speaking in terms of what it was like in the 1950s, and the dilemma that one faced is, to live out one's life in this small, cramped room where maybe one feels more like oneself, or to venture out into a broader society and not return to that room. And I think that there's other symbolism built into Giovanni's room. He describes the two windows that face out into the courtyard, that he doesn't put curtains on, and instead paints this white wax on it or whatever, so that light still comes through, but people can't see in. And then he describes those as like two giant eyes constantly looking into the room. And then in the room, Giovanni says it's full of all of Paris's refuse. All the garbage in Paris is dumped in his room. And maybe that speaks to how, regardless of who's there, who's homosexual, they're clumped in, or maybe the only place that they can find a place, in 1950s Paris, is among the refuse and in the gutter.
Yeah, and Giovanni's constantly working on trying to improve it,
yeah.
But it's a total uphill battle.
Yeah, and David comes in and tries to improve it, but ultimately finds that he's incapable of doing that. Which I think I enjoyed the book without needing that symbolism, but I also, upon reflecting on it, like, why is this called Giovanni's room? What's the significance of that? I appreciated unpacking what the symbolism that I think is there. What did you guys think about that? Was that heavy-handed? Did you read it that way? Am I over-analyzing?
I think you're correctly analyzing. I don't think it's over-analyzing. I didn't find it heavy-handed. It did seem to be like the main imagery and the main, metaphor over the course of the novel is, what this represents. And, I will say, after laying it out like that, I'm like, yeah, that's okay. I like that. I'll maybe knock this up a small notch, but I don't know if it's enough to like just remove that feeling, or rather the lack of feeling of being moved by this in any way. Like, I'm not even sure, like, if you like read the whole novel with that in mind, of like, just think about this literally as a room, think about this as like an allegory, if that shifts anything. Yeah, I think it's definitely Baldwin working through stuff, and just like he fills a bunch of biblical imagery in the rest of his works, that this is his way of sort of trying to like get to like the social commentary. But I think it works for me. I like it. Was that garbage? That might have been garbage.
No, it's all right. We're all over the place, man.
I know.
This is going to be a weird one. I don't know, Nathan, how you feeling?
I don't know. I'm kind of disappointed that I haven't swayed the needle at all. I mean, maybe it comes down to like, did you enjoy reading it? Did you enjoy the act of reading it? And, regardless, you can't like analyze yourself into appreciation, really. So
yeah,
I enjoyed reading it. It's a little pulpy, I think, and I kind of enjoyed that. I kind of enjoyed that it's, it's murder in the streets of Paris and
right,
all these homosexuals, and it's got this like 1950s just kind of sensationalism to it, to the narrative, that I don't know, I liked. I enjoyed. And then these observations about humanity sprinkled throughout that.
I like everything that you like about it, but just the fact that it hinges on such a weak central character who seems desperately like he wants to act but refuses to act, and seems desperately like he's trying to search for something and yet never gets there. Or even when he does get there, it feels empty, that it just keeps it from really going to the next level for me. And I think Nick was onto something, and it's a strange thing to have kind of read a story, the basic structure of a story of the expat a number of times, to where it kind of waters down earlier fiction. I imagine reading this at the time of publication was quite something.
Yeah, all the publishers just actually like politely told him never to send this anywhere else because it's going to ruin your career.
And I think there's also, when Baldwin writes about race, there's a sense of real brutal honesty, like he's digging into the depths of a culture and a society. And here, it's not actually, he doesn't really go that much in depth into the homosexual culture, the treatment of homosexuals. It's still, even though it's throughout the entire novel, it doesn't have that fire. It doesn't have that intensity. It's very much subdued, right? We know it's a fringe culture, and as Nathan described it, it's one that sort of kind of has to exist sort of in the darkness at night in the culture of Paris in the 50s. But I think it's missing some of that raw, in-depth sort of exposure of the conflict with what was then considered, normal culture. The way that Baldwin sort of gets us to address and gets us to confront these difficult things in race. Here, there's not much confrontation. Am I alone seeing that?
Yeah, I'm on board with that. I think that's a lot of what I was feeling, or maybe not feeling, because that's how this novel was positioned in my head before I read it.
Yes.
And then I found it to be
that's
different.
A problem.
Yeah, right. Maybe it's just expectations.
Okay, so talking through actually made me think differently a little bit. Okay.
You won, Nathan.
Yes, partial victory.
Partial victory.
I'll accept it.
Yeah, I think it's part of, Nick, maybe you too, but accepting that I had high expectations and maybe somewhat false expectations going into the book.
Right. Maybe if you had read this like first or second in your list of Baldwins, it would have had greater impact. Who knows? Can never go back. It's just a slow degradation until death.
That's right. It's cold out there.
Yeah.
Way to wrap it up, guys.
Is that whew.
Thanks for listening, everybody. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes. We'd love to hear from you, and it helps other people find the podcast. Now, I have a little announcement to make. In October, my girlfriend and I are going to leave San Francisco on a motorcycle to travel over 20,000 miles to Ushuaia, Argentina. So I'm going to be a bit out of touch with the podcast. David and Nick will hold down the fort, and if I can find some good Wi-Fi access, I'll try to check in from time to time. If you're interested in following along with Dianna and my adventures, check out our website, www.2ifby.land. Until next time, peace.
Be like, wah, 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 wah.